Hi. Today I'm switching gears and I want to talk about gender and literature in modern Iran, beginning from constitutional revolution and specifically during the Pahlavi era. Literature in the early 20th century Iran was closely tied to a desire for political, social, and cultural reform, as well as for the construction of a modern Iranian nationalism, which was nevertheless presented as a preserving of somewhat pure Mother Iran. Iranian modernity is tightly interlaced with notions of a female nation, a homeland, or Mother Iran, whose purity and chastity is intertwined with the concept of male honor. Um, as Afsaneh Najmabadi suggests, and I'm quoting, Iranian nationalism was formed around Khak Pak Vatan, which is translated as the pure soil of homeland, which reconfigured Vatan from its earlier Perso-Islamic meanings as one's birthplace to a modern territorialized homeland imagined as a female body, end quote. This female body was given voice as long as it represented Mother Iran, the mother nation. As modernity, modern fiction, and female purity were intertwined in this new nationalist discourse, the way political, sociocultural, and religious institutions defined female sexuality and Iranian womanhood were all reflected in the cultural productions of modern Iran. Now, Iran witnessed an increase in women's writings about their experiences, their lives, their thoughts, and their bodies beginning in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But before getting there, I want to talk about the constitutional era because it was a turning point both in terms of Iranian history and literature. During the final years of Nassereddin Shah's reign, the educated intelligentsia actually began to demand greater social justice and including greater rights for women. But the constitutional revolution, which was brought to an end with the Russian military intervention in 1911, could only make limited gains in this arena. After years of anarchy and destruction during the World War I, Iran was on the verge of disintegration. Ahmad Shah was young and incompetent, and his cabinet was corrupt. So, if we consider Iran as the female or the mother nation, this was a time period when the nation is fatherless due to a series of inexperienced and easily swayed monarchs that ruled the country between 1911 and 1921. During the constitutional revolution, one of the authors to discuss women's rights or women's issues or concerns was Ali Akbar de Khoda in his newspaper Sur Israfil. Using satire in his section called Charand o Parand, he critiques imposed marriages, polygamy, parents and husbands' tyranny and oppression, and women's superstitious beliefs. At the same time, women's issues and the inequality between women and men came under scrutiny by Iranian women committed to women's rights. And one of these women was Sadiqeh Dolatabadi, who opened one of the first Iranian girls' schools in Isfahan in 1918. Women's active participation in the constitutional revolution enabled them to assert their agency in establishing their own political, social, and scholarly publications and in raising awareness about women's status through their writings. And the first publication by women was called was Danish newspaper, which was in 1910. Consequently, women began writing and publishing in newspapers and magazines established by fellow women. And the first newspaper that had the word woman in its title was Zaban Zanon, literally translated as women's language, first published by Dolatabadi in Esfahan in 1920. However, women's writings were largely limited to newspapers and magazines during these times. And of note is the fact that although women were actively writing, they were not being published outside of their own magazines and journals, which speaks about the male dominated sphere of writing. These publications continued to increase in numbers in the years leading up to the 1921 coup d'etat. However, the focus was on women's education, child rearing, and women's and children's health. It was still too early for them to discuss like women's rights explicitly and the need for equality within domestic spheres. During the early years of the Constitution, the emphasis shifted to focus on women's status, their freedom, and their right to equality in the family and society. Now, the literature of this time also emphasized issues such as imposed and inequitable marriages and the miseries and misfortunes that this kind of marriages brought to women. And novelists such as Morteza Moshfegh Kazemi, Yahya Dolatabadi, and Abbas Khalili were no longer writing about the charms and coquetry of women, but about women's inner psychological and emotional struggles as they grappled with these issues and grappled for justice while at the mercy of an unjust socio-political system. After the Constitutional Revolution, female protagonists also began appearing in literature, linking it to historical moments of social education. According to literary scholar and writer Shahrukh Meskoob, and I'm quoting, in the old social world, women were domesticated and paralyzed and had no way out of their confined familial lives. The most desirable characteristics of such women were beauty, loyalty, obedience, and shame. This was an ideal woman. But these women had no individuality. They were part of a collective, and like all other mistresses and sweethearts, they were objects of love and desire. End quote. So during the chaotic final years of Ahmad Shah's reign, with the help of the British, Reza Khan and Sayyid Zia ad-Din Tabatabai staged a coup d'etat and took control of the country's military forces. Soon Ahmad Shah left Iran for Europe, and many constitutionalists decided to back Reza Khan as he shared some of their ideas about creating a modern Iranian society. Between 1924 and 1925, the first social novel written in Iran by Morteza Moshfegh Kazemi, that is called Tehran Makhuf, was published. The story revolves around women's issues, the internal occupation of the society during the final years of the Qajar dynasty, the socio-political corruption of the system, and the early years of the Pahlavi reign. Despite the amateurish prose and literature, its socio-political and socio-critical perspective had a significant impact on the genre of social novels, which highlights the social realities of people's lives. Like many other social novels, however, Moshfegh Kazemi's work also explores political and government corruption and social insecurity during the years after the Constitutional Revolution, as well as the public's desperation after the revolution failed to achieve its intended goals and result. Now, some of the characters that we see in these novels are sex workers and female sex workers and other working class employees, who are the most common character types in these novels, including in Tehran and Makhuf. In the context of earlier discussed modernity, nationalism, the female body, and modern nation, Moshfegh Kazemi's work is significant in depicting the fatherless female nation, the fatherless Iran in need of a father, a guardian, in the hands of ineffectual monarchs and government officials who are corrupt. This political inefficacy is portrayed also in other social novels of the time, and the treatment of the country, as well as the treatment of women and the female body and sexuality, are only representations of this political inefficacy. With Reza Shah's emergence as the ruler of the nation and his attempts to unify the country under Mother Iran, the nation, or the Vatan, and the female body came under the protection of the collective masculine monarch and state, albeit another ineffectual one in light of the fact that not all women lauded Reza Shah's attempts at modernization and gender reforms. So it is a time, we're talking about a time that the motherland, the mother nation, is left without a male guardian. She is in need of a protector to bring order to the nation, as well as defend her from the interference of foreign forces. Therefore, we had the 1921 coup d'etat. Similarly, the novel Tehran and Makhuf portrays the female body and protection of the female chastity as a matter of male honor, one that can be defended only by being brought under the control of a male guardian and male surveillance. During such chaotic times, the female body comes to represent the bedrock upon which the foundations of the country are being built. Now, the authors of the constitutional era focused on the social role of literature. For these authors, the current literary structure and sense of aesthetics did not have much value. As a result of the revolutionary conditions, their stories embodied more critical thought, exalted justice and liberty rather than literary analysis. Literary works of the time, therefore, revolve around the tensions between the protagonist and the existing regime, manifested through the character's socioeconomic conditions. Now, during Reza Shah's reign, women were encouraged to participate in national, political, and social spheres. In so doing, a new generation of educated and liberal women writers emerged, and among them, the most well-known of these writers was Parveen Ehtesami. According to literary critic Farzaneh Milani, when Ehtesami's poems first appeared in print, and I'm quoting, they were considered a curiosity that could only be accounted for as some kind of aberration, end quote. And this was due to the question of ability and authority, as she was breaking the male-dominated mold of the Iranian writing sphere. The literati of the day, largely men, could not fathom that a woman could have that much of sophistication and sophisticated writing ability. Therefore, they assumed that the poems written by Ehtesami were written by a man. In her later poems, Ehtesami continued to defend her writing and her own voice and her authority, protesting, quote, the status of honorary manhood conferred upon her, end quote. However, suspicions about Etesami's gender persisted. She never gave up, continued to write until the end of her life. With increased consciousness about women's social status, women became more aware of gender inequality and began focusing their literary and scholarly intentions upon it. In the 1940s, Iran witnessed a growth in the populist works among the intellectuals. These thinkers try to expose the miseries experienced by the oppressed people who were being crushed under the dictatorial political system of the country. They wanted their readers to know about the necessity of addressing these issues of the lower strata of the society and the degeneration of the social this social class, this working class. It was during the 1940s that Iranian storytelling began disclosing various aspects of the political system that was destroying people's individuality and creating passive and indifferent citizens. The most prominent characteristic of this stage of the story writing was the broad scope of subjects that attended to the miserable and catastrophic conditions facing both individuals and society at large. These narratives were constructed through depictions of people's lived experiences. And some examples of these works can be found in the works of Sadegh Hedayat, Jalal Ahmad, and Sadegh Chubak. One of the most important themes that we find, for example, in Chubak's works is the relationship between men and women and female sexual instincts. Female sexuality is a topic that most of Chubak's contemporaries avoided. And if they did address it, they attended to it in the framework of sex work or foreign or non-Iranian women in order to portray the advanced impacts of Western culture and Westernization and modernization on Iranian society. Sexual repression and silence about sexual instincts due to moral, religious, cultural, or social forces is only one of the themes through which Chubak draws readers' attention to the deprivation of women in Iranian society. Poverty, the financial dependence of women on men, and superstitious and religious beliefs about women as inferior creatures that are meant to serve male exploitation are also themes of the themes that can be found in these works at this time period, including in Chubak's works, where Chubak addresses these themes through his female characters, who many of whom are among the poor and working class members of society or outcasts within the society. Through these people, Chubak shows that although these people, these characters, are byproducts of the society that views them as subhuman, they are as human as anyone else with emotions and desires because Chubak attends to their inner psychological matters as well. Now, these victims of society, Chubak portrays them as victims that have no say in their lives and in their futures and subsist only in their instinctual existence. In addition to Chubak, Jalal al-Ahmad, Ibrahim Golestan, as I mentioned, Sadegh Hedayat also were among the authors in the 1940s that attended to women's social and social issues and women's rights. Women in their stories, particularly at this time in history, are mostly traditional Iranian housewives. They're portrayed as naive women with no complexities. Each one of these authors views gender, of course, gender relations of power from the perspective of their own experiences and their own environment. So, for example, the way that Sadegh Hedayat looks at these issues is very different from the way that Jalal Ahmad does. For instance, Ali Ahmad examines housewives within the traditional and religious space and pictures their fears and fantasies. Some examples of such works can be found in شوهر آمریکایی، جشن فرخنده، خواهرم و عنکبوت، زن زیادی، لاک صورتی و بچه مردم and گناه. These are all works by Jalal al-Ahmad. Women in these narratives by al-Ahmad are subject to male extortion in different ways. Their confined lives cause them to have strong desires and fantasies. Reasonably or not, because men in these stories ignore women's desires so much, the women are forced to abandon their children on the streets. For example, we see this in Bache Mardom. In his works, Ebrahim Golestan, on the other hand, typically does not attend to matters of religion, but when he does, he highlights the negative aspects of religion, especially in several of his works on women. Some of most important works by Golestan are Bedozdi Rafteha, Yadegar Seporde, and Safar Ismat. These are works that are about women's oppressions. He emphasizes the conditions of maidservants who have been treated unkindly, women who have lost their husbands to political turmoil, or women who are only seen as sex objects and have nowhere to go or no one to turn to in a male-dominated society. Now let's turn to 1950s and 1960s. At this time period, the state, the regime, we are at this point in time, we are under the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah. The state strengthened its control over the country, and in response, the idea of pessimistic despair began appearing in literature of the time. In this battle between the state and the people, ideas such as liberty, democracy, and social justice became cherished qualities of Iranian society, which, according to literary critique Ahmad Karimi Haqqaq, were being brutally trampled. The literati of this period began identifying the Pahlavi regime as a secular dictatorship. The country suffered political repression, and various forms of literature were censored or restricted entirely, or especially among these restrictions and censorships were protest writings, the literature of resistance, for instance, or dissident literature. Writers at this time period were focused on the issues that they were grappling with in terms of concerned with the state, and they were forced to grapple with these limits of censorship and restrictions on their social liberties. And this created a tension also within their works. The tension existed in their relationship with the state and within the society, but also it was reflected in their works. In addition to state restrictions and political repression, Iranian writers had to deal with yet another equally repressive social institution, which was that of the religion. Neither the version of modernity advocated by the regime nor the traditionalism supported by the clergy provided people with a resolution to the existing questions of the nation at this time period. Conscious of this gap, the intellectuals of the time felt that it was their responsibility to reflect on the realities of the time. These intellectuals perceived themselves, and I'm quoting, as minds and souls unperforated by total political commitment or anachronistic apathy, producing literature conscious of aesthetic measures and principles, yet deeply rooted in the tumultuous soil of its social and cultural reality. Literature perceived as having an existence unto itself, yet organically related to other realities surrounding it, end quote. During this time, we also have Forough Farrokhzad and Simin Daneshvar publishing works and furthering women's voices and conceptions of life. Now, in literary critics, Dominic Bergshaw and Nasrin Brahimieh's words, and I'm quoting, like other Iranian women of her era, Farrokhzad would have been subjected to conflicting views about women with a strong traditional undercurrent of assumptions about women's place at home and an opposing current of modernity arguing for women's public presence, end quote. Similarly, Farzaneh Milani comments that Farrokhzad's poetry is, quote, an oasis of the conventionally forbidden, textual and sexual. From first to last, her poems, in spite of their varying content and form, have a certain rebelliousness in common. They portray an iconoclast making herself not all made and finished by men, an uncompromising, unaccommodating sort of a woman, the kind that would rather break than sway with the breeze, end quote. Farrokhzad's writings were groundbreaking, redefining womanhood as capable of exercising complex emotion and defying the view that womanhood was traditionally limited to marriage and motherhood. While Daneshvar's writings were also influential, her female characters challenged the normative understandings of womanhood within the domestic sphere. Using the traditional sphere of the, for example, kitchen, Daneshvar presents the readers with female protagonists who subvert the status quo even within the kitchen and the domestic sphere. Due to their unique perspectives about life and their artistic understanding of women's issues in the 1960s and 1970s, women writers' works at this time constituted the beginning of a new literary trend seeking to express women's individuality. Their writings expanded on corporeal issues such as sexuality, while also destabilizing the status quo concerning the female body by presenting disruptive representations of it. So these representations and these female protagonists written by women were representations of a modern nation or women who no longer needed guardians or protectors or saviors. They did have their own, they exercised their own agency. The Iranian literati viewed the Pahlavi era as politically repressive and restrictive, particularly with respect to artistic and social endeavors. And this perspective is reflected in their works where they deal with the government-led repression and the incarceration of the anti-state activists and writers. And as I mentioned, in addition to this political repression, Iranian intellectuals were also concerned with the institution of religion, which was equally repressive. Examples of works that deal with this kind of repression can be found in Sadegh Hedayat's Talab Amurzesh, Jalal Al Ahmad's Iftar Bi Moqe, and of course in Sadegh Chubak's Sang Sabur. Mohammad Reza Qanunparvar calls these two repressive institutions the demons which authors attempted to exorcise from Iranian society. In Michael Hillman's words, this social commitment or ta'ahud adabi, this was a quote unquote conscious ta'ahud adabi for many authors of the time. In the second Pahlavi era, in the late 1960s, the Iranian literati had formed the Organization of Writers of Iran to resist Pahlavi censorship and fight for freedom, for expression, and the press. Some of the themes that this organization endorsed include opposition to the Pahlavi regime, the critique of certain aspects of Shiism, concerns about economic and social backwardness, the loss of Iranian identity and Iranian roots, cultural nationalism, and all of these can be found in the literature of this period in various works. The Pahlavi regime, however, was a period of clashes and conflicting desires between tradition and modernity, a topic central to all of the works that I just discussed or mentioned. During this time, Iran was forming a new self-perception amidst collective apprehension regarding gender reforms and transformations regarding the female body and new forms of sexual expression, including so many other social, political, cultural reforms and transformations that were happening in the country at the time. These reforms, however, did not necessarily bring women closer to their goal of equality, given the challenges they posed to the cultural imperative of female chastity and modesty. Nonetheless, out of these new forms of writings, a new genre that focused on women's own representation of their bodily experiences and multi-layered subjectivity emerged. Now, as Afsaneh Najmabadi writes, and I'm quoting, one group of female writers strove to rescript Iranian women's language, tending to produce a sexually demarked language, a veiled language of women's body and bodily presentations in public, striving to create a disciplined, chaste body, veiling its sexually marked messages, expressing sexuality otherwise. And the other group was concerned with women's wisdom and knowledge, striving to transform traditional female know-how to replace the old feminine superstitions and nonsenses with the new sciences and scientific sensibilities, end quote. These clashes continue, but women have inaugurated a new language that rejects the male-dominated language of the writing sphere, fostering a new vision of their corporeal realities. Now, in fact, women have decorporealized the female body through their works. And this trend actually continued even after the Pahlavi era into the 1980s after the Islamic Revolution. While the female body has historically been devalued, Iranian women have demonstrated and continue to demonstrate to this day that the same body disrupts current discourses and subverts normative patriarchal understandings of female embodiment. As we see in this brief sketch that I just provided you, the Pahlavi era was a time when the majority of the country's intellectuals shared inclinations towards a literary approach that the scholar Mohammad Reza Ghanum Parvar describes as, and I'm quoting, form and social commitment in content with novelistic technique, narrative voice, and colloquial and literary language, and a continuing search for new means of poetic expression with engagement or social commitment, and conscious or subconscious treatment of the shortcomings of society and of the hardships of the individual or the masses, end quote. The most volatile yet glorious moments of modernist Iranian literature can be found in the writings of the intellectuals in the 1960s. The outcomes of a nation moving toward modernity, the anxieties about the resulting freedoms, and the reforms in gender relations were only a few reasons for these metaphoric tremors and volatility that I just discussed.